In our last class, we reviewed the sociology and anthropology of violence. Today, we will go over the political science and economics of violence. Political and economic forces are deeply intertwined in shaping human behavior, social order, and conditions that foster violence. As Portuguese philosopher Baruch Spinoza wrote, "Peace is not the absence of war, but a virtue." In both politics and economics, we find that the end result of structural inequality is an undermining of that virtue. We are here to understand violence as more than a series of tragic eruptions. By the end, hopefully, we will see it as a product of the systems we build, the way we distribute or choose not to distribute power and wealth, the way we manage differences, or the way we choose to respond or not to respond to scarcity or injustices. Political science and economics provide the theoretical and empirical tools to explain not only why societies descend into violence, but also how they can emerge from it. Political science, once centered narrowly on institutions and statesmen, now recognizes the need to address violent behavior as an integral part of the political landscape. Thinkers from Machiavelli to Thomas Hobbes understood violence as a means of securing authority or controlling chaos. But contemporary political scientists ask more nuanced questions. They examine how inequality, exclusion, and governance determine whether peaceful channels fail and social conflicts escalate into violent struggle. The field has evolved from studying interstate wars to analyzing civil conflict, terrorism, and breakdown of institutions. We saw how the waning of great power wars after the Cold War led to internal conflicts, and with that, the realization that state fragility and economic disparity matter more than ideology in explaining why violence erupts. Two key frameworks dominate these analyses. The first, called the grievance model, argues that repression, exclusion, and relative deprivation drive rebellion. When people feel denied dignity or opportunity, frustration fuels collective violence. The second, often called the greed model, sees violence as an economically rational act. Access to resources makes rebellion profitable. In practice, however, both dynamics intertwine. Weak institutions magnify inequality, economic crises exacerbate political grievances, and the resulting instability leads to violence. Studies of youth bulges, where large populations of underemployed young people lack political voice, show how demographic pressure amplifies this volatility. Similarly, mounting income inequality not only erodes trust and social cohesion, but correlates strongly with political unrest and interpersonal conflicts. Violence, in other words, is not simply a breakdown of order. It is often a reaction to the perceived illegitimacy of the order itself. Historical examples highlight these patterns. The armed Basque nationalist groups in northern Spain and southwestern France demonstrated how identity and economic marginalization can radicalize a movement that began as cultural self-assertion into one defined by violence. Apartheid, South Africa, showed how a political system designed to protect privilege and institutional violence for decades, only to reveal through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission how truth-telling can help dismantle systemic brutality. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward illustrated that state-imposed economic transformation can become mass violence when ideological rigidity overrides reality. The Bosnian Wars' systematic use of rape as a weapon of ethnic cleansing showed how political aims can exploit the human body. And Haiti's military dictatorship of the 1990s exposed how economic despair fuels authoritarian terror. Each case underscores that political and economic institutions can serve to organize, legitimize, and reproduce violence. Economics helps us to understand how scarcity and inequality make violence rational to those trapped within unjust systems. The basic economic model assumes that people make choices through a cost-benefit analysis. But when survival is at stake, violence may appear as the only viable strategy. Poverty increases the appeal of coercion, both within families and between factions. By contrast, fair economic opportunity acts as a stabilizing force. Research in India showed that women's economic empowerment significantly reduces their risk of domestic violence, while regions that experience inclusive growth show fewer civil strife. Economics, therefore, offers a language for describing how structural inequality creates environments where violence seems profitable, even inevitable. At the micro level, theories such as rational choice and game theory explain how competition and mistrust can spiral into coercion. When cooperative systems break down, actors may use violence to secure advantage. But humans are not perfectly rational. Our decisions are bounded by emotion, habit, and misperception. People may commit acts of violence not because it is profitable in the long term, but because they misread risk or feel cornered. In this sense, behavioral economics brings psychological realism to theories of conflict, reminding us that fear, shame, and humiliation can outweigh material calculation. Economic deprivation also reduces collective patience, making short-term conflicts seem more rewarding than long-term cooperation. At the macro level, the picture becomes systemic. The African Development Bank identifies inequality, low income, and competition for scarce resources as key predictors of violence. The Keynesian school hypothesizes that austerity and billionaire tax evasion erode public trust and spur social unrest. Recent studies confirm that wage stagnation, unemployment, and cuts in social welfare correlate with rising crime and extremist recruitment. Violence also destroys economies. The World Bank calls it the primary cause of poverty. War and crime devastate infrastructure, displace workers, and discourage investment. In fragile states, gross domestic product, or GDP, may shrink by half within 5 years of civil conflict. Peace, therefore, is not just a moral good, it is an economic advantage. Underlying both disciplines is the question of power. In political science, power is the capacity to shape the behavior of others. In economics, it is the control over resources. When distributed fairly, power enables cooperation and stability. When concentrated, it becomes domination. Classical theorists, from Aristotle to sociologist Max Weber, described power as both creative and corrupting. Political theorist Hannah Arendt distinguished between power, or the ability to act together effectively, and violence, which arises when true power erodes. In today's world, however, neoliberal governance blurs these boundaries. As private corporations assume functions once held by states, accountability diminishes and structural violence deepens. Economic inequality becomes political instability. Plutocrats are allowed to insulate themselves from consequences, as they control the political class. The concentration of wealth thus reproduces domination through markets and money the way it once has through monarchs or dictators. Economists like Thomas Piketty and Kate Raworth have done what the great sociologist Johan Galtung did 40 years earlier. They reframed inequality itself as a form of systemic violence. Their work shows that extreme wealth concentration shortens lives, corrodes democracy, and provokes rebellion. Violence is not only behavioral, but embedded in economic systems that deny millions the chance to live with dignity. The same insight underlies political arguments for redistributive justice. Reducing inequality is not charity, but a strategy for preventing violence. Similarly, empirical research now confirms that gender equality and inclusive governance dramatically lower both domestic and political violence. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of fairness. Taken together, political science and economics describe a feedback loop. Inequality breeds violence, and violence in turn deepens inequality. Breaking this cycle requires not just policing or diplomacy, but structural reform. Policies that expand opportunity, empower marginalized groups, and make grievance expressions possible without bloodshed. Initiatives that invest in youth employment, education, and gender equity consistently show the greatest peace dividends. By contrast, societies that rely solely on coercion or containment often discover that repression is a poor substitute for justice. We now see again that violence is not inevitable, even from a political or economic perspective. It reflects the systems we design and the incentives we tolerate. Political science shows how institutions channel or suppress conflict. Economics reveals how material conditions and inequities shape human choices. Together, they teach that power, when hoarded, decays into domination. And peace requires its redistribution. As Spinoza suggested, peace is not merely an interlude between wars, but a disposition toward justice. If violence is the language of the unheard, our task is to build institutions, political, economic, and moral, that allow people to speak before they are pushed to fight.